Hi everyone, my name's Otis Gray, and you are listening to Sleepy, which is a show where I read you old books to help you get to sleep. Sleepy is actually a podcast that I've adapted for YouTube, and you can find over 60 books at this point of me just reading in a really low voice to help you doze off into a deep, deep slumber. You can find all these books on the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and everywhere else. So if you like listening to podcasts to go to sleep as well as watching YouTube, then you can search for Sleepy on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else. But that's really all the show is. You lie back and get really comfortable, and I just read you a bedtime story. And that's it. So, tonight is a very highly requested book from a lot of our listeners, and it is a portrait of the artist as a young man by James Joyce, which, judging by James Joyce's writing and the length of the title and the relatively boring cover of the book, and my very boring voice, I'm hoping that this will get you to sleep really quick. I love going and finding books in the library because you never know what you're going to find in them. This one has looks like it's an airplane ticket. No, it's a train ticket from Penn Station to Rutland, Vermont. How cool is that? It's a boarding pass. There's nothing like going in the library and just picking out a book that seems to speak to you, which is generally how I pick books for this show, but I saw this one and I know that it was very highly requested by a lot of our listeners. So that's enough of me rambling, even though that's what I'm about to do for quite a while. But I will get right to the book. So now, you can just fluff up your pillow just how you like it. Feel yourself melt into your bed. Get really comfortable. And then close your eyes. And let me read to you. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was down along the road met a nicened little boy named Baby Tuco. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was a baby Tuco. The moo cow came down the road where Betty Byrne lived. She sold lemon plat. Oh, the wild rose blossoms on the little green place. He sang that song. That was his song. Oh, the green woth bodeth. When you wet the bed, first it is warm, then it gets cold. His mother put on the oil sheet. That had the queer smell. His mother had a nicer smell than his father. She played on the piano the sailor's hornpipe for him to dance, and he danced. Tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-dee, tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la-la. Uncle Charles and Dante clapped. They were older than his father and mother, but Uncle Charles was older than Dante. Dante had 2 brushes in her press. The brush with the maroon velvet back was for Michael Davitt, and the brush with the green velvet back was for Parnell. Dante gave him a cachu every time he brought her a piece of tissue paper. The Vances lived in number 7. They had a different father and mother. They were Eileen's father and mother. When they were grown up, he was going to marry Eileen. He hid under the table. His mother said, "Oh, Stephen will apologize." Dante said, "Oh, if not, the eagles will come and pull out his eyes. Pull out his eyes, apologize, apologize, pull out his eyes. Apologize, pull out his eyes, pull out his eyes, apologize." The wide playgrounds were swarming with boys. All were shouting, and the prefects urged them on with strong cries. The evening air was pale and chilly, and after every charge and thud of the footballers, the greasy leather orb flew like a heavy bird through the gray light. He kept on a fringe of his line, out of sight of his prefect, out of the reach of rude feet, feigning to run now and then. He felt his body small and weak amid the throng of players, and his eyes were weak and watery. Rhodey Kickham was not like that. He would be captain of the third line, all the fellows said. Rhodey Kickham was a decent fellow, but Nasty Roche was a stink. Rhodey Kickham had Greaves in his number and a hamper in the refectory. Nasty Roche had big hands. He called the Friday pudding dog in a blanket, and one day he had asked, "What is your name?" Stephen had answered, "Stephen de Dallas." Then Nasty Roche had said, "What kind of a name is that?" And when Stephen had not been able to answer, Nasty Roche had asked, "What is your father?" Stephen had answered, "A gentleman." Then Nasty Roche had asked, "Is he a magistrate?" He crept about from point to point on the fringe of his line, making little runs now and then, but his hands were bluish with cold. He kept his hands in the side pockets of his belted gray suit. That was a belt round his pocket, and belt was also to give a fellow a belt. One day a fellow had said to Cantwell, "I'd give you such a belt in a second." Cantwell had answered, "Go and fight your match. Give Cecil Thunder a belt. I'd like to see you. He'd give you a toe in the rump for yourself." That was not a nice expression. His mother had told him not to speak with the rough boys in the college. Nice mother. The first day in the hall of the castle, when she said goodbye, she had put up her veil double to her nose to kiss him, and her nose and eyes were red, that he had pretended not to see, that she was going to cry. She was a nice mother, but she was not so nice when she cried. And his father had given him 2 5-shilling pieces for pocket money. His father had told him if he wanted anything to write home to him, and whatever he did, never peach on a fellow. Then at the door of the castle, the rector had shaken hands with his father and mother, his soutane fluttering in the breeze, and the car had driven off with his father and mother in it. They had cried to him from the car, waving their hands, "Goodbye, Stephen. Goodbye. Goodbye, Stephen. Goodbye." He was caught in the whirl of a scrimmage, and, fearful of the flashing eyes and muddy boots, bent down to look through the legs. The fellows were struggling and groaning, and their legs were rubbing and kicking and stamping. Then Jack Lawton's yellow boots dodged out the ball, and the other boots and legs ran after. He ran after them a little way and then stopped. It was useless to run on. Soon they would be going home for the holidays. After supper in the study hall, he would change the number pasted up inside his desk from 77 to 76. It would be better in the study hall than out there in the cold. The sky was pale and cold, but there were lights in the castle. He wondered from which window Hamilton Rowan had thrown his hat on the ha-ha, and had there been flower beds at the time under the windows. One day, when he had been called to the castle, the butler had shown him the marks of the soldiers' slugs in the wood of the door, and had given him a piece of the shortbread that the community ate. It was nice and warm to see the lights in the castle. It was like something in a book. Perhaps Leicester Abbey was something like that. And there were nice sentences in Dr. Cornwell's spelling book. They were like poetry, but there were only sentences to learn from spelling them. Wolsey died in Leicester Abbey, where the abbots buried him. The canker is a disease of plants. Cancer, one of animals. It would be nice to lie on the hearthrug before the fire, leaning his head upon his hands, and think on those sentences. He shivered, as if he had cold slimy water next to his skin. That was mean of Wells to shoulder him into the square ditch because he would not swap his little snuff box for Wells's seasoned hacking chestnut, the Conqueror of 40. How cold and slimy the water had been. A fellow had once seen a big rat jump into the scum. Mother was sitting at the fire with Dante, waiting for Bridget to bring in the tea. She had her feet on the fender, and her Julie slippers were so hot, and they had such a lovely warm smell. Dante knew a lot of things. She had taught him where the Mozambique Channel was, and what was the longest river in America, and what was the name of the highest mountain in the moon. Father Arnauld knew more than Dante because he was a priest, but both his father and Uncle Charles said that Dante was a clever woman and a well-read woman. And when Dante made that noise after dinner and then put up her hand to her mouth, there was heartburn. A voice cried far out in the playground, "All in." Then the other voices cried from the lower and third lines, "All in, all in." The players closed round, flushed and muddy, and he went among them, glad to go in. Rhodey Kickham held the ball by its greasy lace. The fellow asked him to give it one last, but he walked on without even answering the fellow. Simon Moonan told him not to because the prefect was looking. The fellow turned to Simon Moonan and said, "We all know why you speak. You are McGlade's suck." Suck was a queer word. The fellow called Simon Moonan that name because Simon Moonan used to tie the prefect's false sleeves behind his back, and the prefect used to let on to be angry. But the sound was ugly. Once he had washed his hands in the lavatory of the Wicklow Hotel, and his father pulled the stopper up by the chain after the dirty water went down through the hole in the basin. And when it had all gone down slowly, the hole in the basin had made a sound like that. Suck, only louder. To remember that, and the white look of the lavatory made him feel cold, then hot. There were two cocks that he turned and water came out, cold and hot. He felt cold and then a little hot, and he could see the names printed on the cocks. That was a very queer thing. And the air in the corridor chilled him too. It was queer and wettish. But soon the gas would be lit, and in burning, it made a light noise like a little song, always the same. And when the fellows stopped talking in the playroom, you could hear it. It was the hour for sums. Father Arnauld wrote a hard sum on the board and then said, "Now then, who will win? Go ahead, York. Go ahead, Lancaster." Stephen tried his best, but the sum was too hard, and he felt confused. The little silk badge with the white rose on it that was pinned on the breast of his jacket began to flutter. He was no good at sums, but he tried his best so that York might not lose. Father Arnold's face looked very black, but he was not in wax. He was laughing. Then Jack Lawton cracked his fingers, and Father Arnold looked at his copybook and said, "Right. Bravo, Lancaster. The red rose wins. Come on now, York. Forge ahead." Jack Lawton looked over from his side. The little silk badge with the red rose on it looked very rich because he had a blue sailor top on. Stephen felt his own face red too, thinking of all the bets about who would get first place in elements, Jack Lawton or he. Some weeks Jack Lawton got the card for the first, and some weeks he got the card for first. His white silk badge fluttered and fluttered as he worked at the next sum and heard Father Arnold's voice. Then all his eagerness passed away, and he felt his face quite cool. He thought his face might be white because it felt so cool. He could not get out of the answer for the sum, but it did not matter. White roses and red roses, those were beautiful colors to think of. And the cards for first place and third place were beautiful colors too. Pink and cream and lavender. Lavender and cream and pink roses were beautiful to think of. Perhaps a wild rose might be like those colors, and he remembered the song about the wild rose blossoms on the little green place. But you could not have seen a green rose. Perhaps somewhere in the world he could. The bell rang, and then the classes began to file out of the rooms and along the corridors towards the refectory. He sat looking at the 2 big prints of butter on his plate, but could not eat the damp bread. The tablecloth was damp and limp, but he drank off the hot, weak tea, which the clumsy scullion, girt with a white apron, poured into his cup. He wondered whether the scullion's apron was damp too, or whether all white things were cold and damp. Nasty Roche and Sarin drank cocoa that their people sent them in tins. They said they could not drink the tea, that it was hogwash. Their fathers were magistrates, the fellows said. All the boys seemed, to him, very strange. They all had fathers and mothers and different clothes and voices. He longed to be at home and lay his head on his mother's lap, but he could not. And so he longed for the play and study and prayers to be over and to be in bed. He drank another cup of hot tea, and Fleming said, "What's up? Have you a pain, or what's up with you?" "I don't know," Stephen said. "Sick in your breadbasket," Fleming said, "because your face looks white. It will go away." "Oh, yes," Stephen said. But he was not sick there. He thought that he was sick in his heart, if you could be sick in that place. Fleming was very decent to ask him. He wanted to cry. He leaned his elbows on the table and shut and opened the flaps of his ears. Then he heard the noise of the refectory every time he opened the flaps of his ears. It made a roar like a train at night, and when he closed the flaps, the roar was shut off like a train going into a tunnel. That night, at Dalkey, the train had roared like that, and then, when it went into the tunnel, the roar stopped. He closed his eyes and the train went on, roaring and then stopping, roaring again, stopping. It was nice to hear it roar and stop, and then roar out of the tunnel again, and then stop. Then the higher line fellows began to come down along the matting in the middle of the refectory. Paddy Rath and Jimmy McGee and the Spaniard who was allowed to smoke cigars and the little Portuguese who wore the woolly cap. And then the lower line tables and the tables of the third line. And every single fellow had a different way of walking. He sat in a corner of the playroom, pretending to watch a game of dominoes, and once or twice he was able to hear, for an instant, the little song of the gas. The prefect was at the door with some boys, and Simon Moonan was nodding his false sleeves. He was telling them something about Tullabeg. Then he went away from the door, and Wells came over to Stephen and said, "Tell us, Dallas, do you kiss your mother before you go to bed?" Stephen answered, "I do." Wells turned to the other fellows and said, "Oh, I say, here's a fellow says he kisses his mother every night before he goes to bed." The other fellows stopped their game and turned around laughing. Stephen blushed under their eyes and said, "I do not." Wells said, "Oh, I say, here's a fellow says he doesn't kiss his mother before he goes to bed." They all laughed again. Stephen tried to laugh with them. He felt his whole body hot and confused in a moment. What was the right answer to the question? He had given two, and still Wells laughed. But Wells must know the right answer, for he was in third of grammar. He tried to think of Wells's mother, but he did not dare raise his eyes to Wells's face. He did not like Wells's face. It was Wells who had shouldered him into the square ditch that day before, because he would not swap his little snuff box for Wells's seasoned hacking chestnut, the conqueror of 40. It was a mean thing to do. All the fellows said it was, and how cold and slimy the water had been. And a fellow had once seen a big rat jump plop into the scum. The cold slime of the ditch covered his whole body, and when the bell rang for study and the lines filed out of the playrooms, he felt the cold air of the corridor and staircase inside his clothes. He still tried to think, what was the right answer? Was it right to kiss his mother, or wrong to kiss his mother? What did that mean, to kiss? You put your face up like that to say goodnight, and then his mother put her face down. That was the kiss. His mother put her lips on his cheek. Her lips were soft, and they wetted his cheek, and they made a tiny little noise. Kiss. Why did people do that with their faces? Sitting in the study hall, he opened the lid of his desk and changed the number pasted up inside from 77 to 76. But the Christmas vacation was very far away. But one time, it would come because the earth moved round always. There was a picture of the earth on the first page of his geography, a big ball in the middle of clouds. Fleming had a box of crayons, and one night during study he had colored the earth green and the clouds maroon. That was like the two brushes in Dante's press, the brush with the green velvet back for Parnell, and the brush with the maroon velvet back for Michael Davitt. But he had not told Fleming to color them those colors. Fleming had done it himself. He opened the geography to study the lesson, but he could not learn the names of places in America. Still, they were all different places that had different names. They were all in different countries, and the countries were in continents, and the continents were in the world, and the world was in the universe. He turned to the flyleaf of the geography and read what he had written there, himself, his name, and where he was. Stephen to Dallas, class of elements. Clongowes, Wood College, Salins, County Kildare, Ireland, Europe, the world, the universe. That was in his writing. And Fleming one night, for a cod had written on the opposite page, Stephen de Dallas is my name, Ireland is my nation, Clongowes is my dwelling place, and heaven my expectation. He read the verses backwards, but then they were not poetry. Then he read the flyleaf from the bottom to the top, till he came to his own name. That was he. And he read down the page again. What was after the universe? Nothing. But was there anything round the universe to show where it stopped before the nothing place began? It could not be a wall, but there could be a thin, thin line there. All read everything. It was very big to think about everything and everywhere. Only God could do that. He tried to think what a big thought that must be, but he could think only of God. God was God's name, just as his name was Stephen. Dieu was the French for God, and that was God's name too. And when anyone prayed to God and said, Dieu, then God knew at once when it was a French person that was praying. But though there were different names for God in all the different languages in the world, and God understood what all the people who prayed said in their different languages, still God remained always the same God, and God's real name was God. It made him very tired to think that way. It made him feel his head very big. He turned over the flyleaf and looked wearily at the green round earth in the middle of the maroon clouds. He wondered which was right, to be for the green or for the maroon, because Dante had ripped the green velvet back off the brush that was for Parnell one day with her scissors, and had told him that Parnell was a bad man. He wondered if they were arguing at home about that. That was called politics. There were two sides in it. Dante was on one side, and his father and Mr. Casey were on the other side, but his mother and Uncle Charles were on no side. Every day there was something in the paper about it. It pained him that he did not know well what politics meant, and that he did not know where the universe ended. He felt small and weak. When would he be like the fellows in poetry and rhetoric? They had big voices and big boots, and they studied trigonometry. That was very far away. First came the vacation, and then the next term, and then vacation again, and then again another term, and then again the vacation. It was like a train going in and out of tunnels. That was like the noise of the boys eating in the refectory when you opened and closed the flaps of the ears. Term, vacation, tunnel, out, noise, stop. How far away it was. It was better to go to bed, to sleep. Only prayers in the chapel and then bed. He shivered and yawned. It would be lovely in bed after the sheets got a bit hot. First they were so cold to get into. He shivered to think how cold they were first. But then they got hot, and then he could sleep. It was lovely to be tired. He yawned again. Night prayers and then bed. He shivered and wanted to yawn. It would be lovely in a few minutes. He felt a warm glow creeping up from the cold, shivering sheets, warmer and warmer until he felt warm all over, ever so warm, and yet he shivered a little and still wanted to yawn. The bell rang for night prayers, and he filed out of the study hall. after the others and down the staircase and along the corridors to the chapel. The corridors were darkly lit, and the chapel was darkly lit. Soon, all would be dark and sleeping. There was a cold night air in the chapel, and the marbles were the color of the sea at night. The sea was cold day and night, but it was colder at night. It was cold and dark under the sea wall beside his father's house. The kettle would be on the hob to make punch. The prefect of the chapel prayed above his head, and his memory knew the responses. O Lord, open our lips, and our mouth shall announce thy praise. Incline unto our aid, O God. O Lord, make haste to help us. There was a cold night smell in the chapel, but it was a holy smell. It was not like the smell of the old peasants who knelt at the back of the chapel at Sunday Mass. That was a smell of air and rain and turf and corduroy. But they were very holy peasants. They breathed behind him, on his neck, and sighed as they prayed. They lived in Clane, a fellow said. There were little cottages there, and he had seen a woman standing at the half door of a cottage with a child in her arms, as cars had come past from Salins. It would be very lovely to sleep for one night in that cottage before the fire of smoking turf, in the dark lit by the fire, in the warm dark breathing the smell of the peasants, air and rain and turf and corduroy. But oh, the road there between the trees was dark. You would be lost in the dark. It made him afraid to think of how it was. He heard the voice of the prefect of the chapel saying the last prayer. He prayed it too, against the dark, outside under the trees. Visit, we beseech thee, O Lord, this habitation, and drive away from it all the snares of the enemy. May thy holy angels dwell herein to preserve us in peace, and may thy blessing be always upon us, through Christ our Lord. Amen. His fingers trembled as he undressed himself in the dormitory. He told his fingers to hurry up. He had to undress and then kneel and say his own prayers, and be in bed before the gas was lowered, so that he might not go to hell when he died. He rolled his stockings off, and put on his nightshirt quickly, and knelt trembling at his bedside and repeated his prayers quickly, fearing that the gas would go down. He felt his shoulders shaking as he murmured, God bless my father and my mother and spare them to me. God bless my little brothers and sisters and spare them to me. God bless Dante and Uncle Charles and spare them to me. He blessed himself and climbed quickly into bed, tucking the end of the nightshirt under his feet, curled himself together under the cold white sheets, shaking and trembling. But he would not go to hell when he died, and the shaking would stop. A voice bade the boys in the dormitory good night, and he peered out for an instant over the coverlet and saw the yellow curtains round before his bed and shut him off on all sides. The light was lowered quietly. The prefect's shoes went away. Where? Down the staircase and along the corridors or to his room at the end. He saw the dark. Was it true about the black dog that walked there at night with eyes as big as carriage lamps? They said it was the ghost of a murderer. A long shiver of fear flowed over his body. He saw the dark entrance hall of the castle. Old servants in old dress were in the ironing room above the staircase. It was long ago. The old servants were quiet. There was a fire there, but the hall was dark. A figure came up the staircase from the hall. He wore the white cloak of a marshal. His face was pale and strange. He held his hand pressed to his side. He looked out of the strange eyes at the old servants. They looked at him and saw their master's face and cloak and knew that he had received his death wound. But only the dark was there where they looked. Only dark, silent air. Their master had received his death wound on the battlefield of Prague, far away over the sea. He was standing on the field. His hand was pressed to his side. His face was pale and strange, and he wore the white cloak of a marshal. Oh, how cold and strange it was to think of that. All the dark was cold and strange. There were pale, strange faces there, gray eyes like carriage lamps. They were the ghosts of murderers, the figures of marshals who had received their death wound on the battlefields far away over the sea. What did they wish to say, that their faces were so strange? Visit, we beseech thee, O Lord, this habitation, and drive away from it all. Going home for the holidays. That would be lovely. The fellows had told him. Getting up on the cars in the early wintry morning outside the door of the castle, the cars were rolling on the gravel. Cheers for the rector. Hooray, hooray, hooray. The cars drove past the chapel, and all caps were raised. They drove merrily along the country roads. The drivers pointed with their whips to Bowden Down. The fellows cheered. They passed the farmhouse of the jolly farmer, cheer after cheer after cheer. Through Clane they drove, cheering and cheered. The peasant women stood at the half-doors. The men stood here and there. A lovely smell there was in the wintry air, the smell of Clane, rain and wintry air and turf smoldering and corduroy. The train was full of fellows, a long, long chocolate train with cream facings. The guards went to and fro, opening, closing, locking, unlocking the doors. They were men in dark blue and silver, and they had silvery whistles, and their keys made a quick music. Click, 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 click. And the train raced on over the flat lands and past the hill of Allen. The telegraph poles were passing. The train went on, and knew. There were lanterns in the hall of his father's house, and ropes of green branches. There were holly and ivy around the pier glass, and holly and ivy, green and red, twined round the chandeliers. There were red holly and green ivy round the old portraits on the walls. Holly and ivy for him and for Christmas. Lovely. All the people. Welcome home, Stephen. Noises of welcome. His mother kissed him. Was that right? His father was a marshal now, higher than a magistrate. Welcome home, Stephen. Noises. There was the noise of curtain rings running back along the rods, of water being splashed in the basins. There was a noise of rising and dressing and washing in the dormitory, noise of clapping of hands as the prefect went up and down, telling the fellows to look sharp. The pale sunlight showed the yellow curtains drawn back, the tossed beds. His bed was very hot, and his face and body were very hot. He got up and sat on the side of the bed. he was weak. He tried to pull on his stocking. It was a horrid, rough feel. The sunlight was queer and cold. Fleming said, "Are you not well?" He did not know. And Fleming said, "Get back into bed. I'll tell McGlade you're not feeling well." "He's sick." "Who is?" "Tell McGlade. Get back into bed." "Is he sick?" A fellow held his arms while he loosened the stocking clinging to his foot and climbed back into the hot bed. He crouched down between the sheets, glad of their tepid glow. He heard the fellows talk among themselves about him as they dressed for mass. It was a mean thing to do, to shoulder him into the square ditch, they were saying. Then their voices ceased. They had gone. A voice at his bed said, "Daedalus, don't spy on us. Sure you won't." Wells' face was there. He looked at it and saw that Wells was afraid. "I didn't mean to." "Sure you won't?" His father had told him, whatever he did, never to peach on a fellow. He shook his head and answered no and felt glad. Wells said, "I didn't mean to. Honor bright. It was only for Cod. I'm sorry." The face and the voice went away. Sorry because he was afraid. Afraid that it was some disease. Canker was a disease of plants, and cancer one of the animals. Or another different. That was a long time ago. Then out in the playgrounds in the evening light, creeping from point to point on the fringe of his line, a heavy bird flying low through the gray light. Leicester Abbey lit up. Wolsey died there. The abbots buried themselves. It was not Wells' face. It was the prefect's. He was not foxing. No. He was sick, really. He was not foxing. And he felt the prefect's hand on his forehead. And he felt his forehead warm and damp against the prefect's cold, damp hand. That was the way a rat felt. Slimy and damp and cold. Every rat had two eyes to look out of. Sleek, slimy coats. Little feet, tucked up to jump. Black, slimy eyes to look out of. They could understand how to jump. But the minds of rats could not understand trigonometry. When they were dead, they lay on their sides. Their coats dried them. They were only dead things. The prefect was there again, and it was his voice that was saying that he was to get up. The father minister had said he was to get up and dress and go to the infirmary. And while he was dressing himself as quickly as he could, the prefect said, "We must pack off to Brother Michael, because we have the collywobbles." He was very decent to say that. That was all to make him laugh. But he could not laugh because his cheeks and lips were all shivery. And then the prefect had to laugh by himself. The prefect cried, "Quick, march, Hayfoot, Strawfoot." They went together down the staircase and along the corridor past the bath. As he passed the door, he remembered with a vague fear the warm, turf-colored bog water, the warm, moist air, the noise of plunges, the smell of towels like medicine. Brother Michael was standing at the door of the infirmary, and from the door of the dark cabinet on his right came a smell like medicine that came from the bottles on the shelves. The prefect spoke to Brother Michael, and Brother Michael answered and called the prefect sir. He had reddish hair mixed with gray and a queer look. It was queer that he would always be a brother. It was queer, too, that you could not call him sir because he was a brother and had a different kind of look. Was he not sir because he was a brother and had a different kind of look? Was he not holy enough? Or why could he not catch up on the others? There were 2 beds in the room, and in one of the beds there was a fellow, and when they went in and he called out, "Hello, it's young Dallas. What's up?" "The sky is up," Brother Michael said. He was a fellow out of the 3rd grammar, and while Stephen was undressing, he asked Brother Michael to bring him a round of buttered toast. "Ah, do," he said. "Butter you up," said Brother Michael. "You'll get your walking papers in the morning when the doctor comes." "Will I?" the fellow said. "I'm not well yet." Brother Michael repeated, "You'll get your walking papers, I tell you." He bent down to rake the fire. He had a long back, like the long back of a tram horse. He shook the poker gravely and nodded his head at the fellow and to the 3rd of grammar. Then Brother Michael went away. After a while, the fellow out of the 3rd of grammar turned in towards the wall and fell asleep. That was the infirmary. He was sick then. Had they written home to tell his mother and father? But it'd be quicker for one of the priests to go himself and tell them. Or he would write a letter for the priest to bring. "Dear Mother, I am sick. I want to go home. Please come and take me home. I am in the infirmary. Your fond son, Stephen." How far away they were. There was cold sunlight outside the window. He wondered if he would die. You could die just the same on a sunny day. He might die before his mother came. Then he would have a dead mass in the chapel, like the way the fellows had told him it was when Little had died. All the fellows would be at the mass, dressed in black, all with sad faces. Wells, too, would be there, but no fellow would look at him. The rector would be there in a coat of black and gold, and there would be tall yellow candles at the altar and round the catafalque. And they would carry the coffin out of the chapel slowly, and he would be buried in the little graveyard of the community off the main avenue of limes. And Wells would be sorry then for what he had done, and the bell would toll slowly. He could hear the tolling. He had said over to himself the song that Bridget had taught him. Ding dong, the castle bell. Farewell, my mother. Bury me in the old churchyard, beside my eldest brother. My coffin shall be black, 6 angels at my back, 2 to sing, and 2 to pray, and 2 to carry my soul away. Thank you for listening to Sleepy.